So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this third of 4 learning series sessions. My name is Tammy Shubat, and I am the Director of Partnerships and Public Affairs at Ophea, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to spend the afternoon with you. I'm going to share my screen. So I wanted to welcome you to Confidence in the Classroom, Understanding the Relationship Between Health and Physical Education and Truth and Reconciliation. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge the land upon which Ophea's work takes place. So Ophea's work takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories all across Ontario. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and to work on these territories and recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land. So as I mentioned, this is the third of 4 learning series sessions, and I noticed based on the participants who are here, a number of you have joined us for all of these. So I'm so thrilled to be able to join you in these learning opportunities together. So a reminder that so today's learning session is on truth and reconciliation, and then tomorrow we'll be convening for the last time, looking at shifting the narrative in health and physical education towards action. So here we're really looking at kind of summarizing some of the key concepts that we've explored in the last 3 sessions and looking at meaningful application in health and physical education. I'd like to contextualize these sessions a little for you, and that is 100 years ago, the idea of Ophea was born out of a collective feeling of optimism and necessity as the world emerged from a global pandemic. Educational institutions played a really important role in curbing the spread of the pandemic, and health and physical education was regarded as the most effective single weapon with which to combat influenza and other communicable diseases. So at the time, that was the Spanish flu pandemic. The idea that children and youth are able to gain the knowledge and skills to lead healthy, active lives is as important now as it was then. Since 1921, Ophea's mandate has focused on providing quality curriculum and classroom supports for teachers to increase their confidence supporting healthy, active living education in multiple environments. So when H&PE programs are delivered in healthy schools and supported by school, staff, families, and communities, learning is most effective. This is the best way to support children and youth to make healthy and safe choices. Though students can learn a great deal about respect for themselves and the differences in others, H&PE has also played a historic role in Canada's colonialism, and it is implicated in racist and oppressive behaviors within the education system. The concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion are central to the implementation of H&PE, and by understanding the collective history of health and physical education, we can begin to unravel how this subject area can contribute to reconciliation and achieve its goals of respecting and celebrating diversity. Where we go from here is up to all of us. So thank you for joining us today and for being a part of the change. A little bit about today's presenter that I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to have join us. So today we have with us Janice Forsyth. He's an associate professor in sociology and director of Indigenous Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. Janice is a member of the Fisher River Cree First Nation, is an associate professor in sociology and director of Indigenous Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. Her research focusing on Indigenous settler relations in Canada, told through the lens of sport, has garnered significant national and international attention. In 2012, she was named a recipient of the Premier's Research Excellence Award for Ontario. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, published in 2015, cited several of her publications, demonstrating how her research is relevant well beyond sport. In 2019, she was elected to the College of the Royal Society of Canada for her research and advocacy on sport and reconciliation. Dr. Forsyth is also an experienced leader in the Canadian nonprofit sector, where she's currently the vice president for the Aboriginal Sports Circle, a national not-for-profit that provides advocacy and support for Indigenous-led sport development in Canada, and a director for Ophea's board of directors, which reaches nearly 2.1 million children and youth through 72 school boards in Ontario. Her co-edited collection, Aboriginal Peoples in Sport in Canada, Historical Foundations and Contemporary Issues, published in 2013, is a standard text in many classrooms throughout Canada. While her monograph, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport, published in 2020, continues to generate positive attention in scholarly and public literary circles. as well as being recommended reading by CBC Books. In September 2020, it was one of 13 books featured in the prestigious Saskatchewan Book Week. And in May 2021, it won the prestigious 2021 North American Society for Sport History Monographs Book Award. So without further ado, Janice, we're so thrilled to have you here today, and I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you everybody for joining me today. Again, thank you everyone for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you're taking to listen to today's session. And I also want to thank Ophea for making space to have this really important conversation. There's been a genuine upswing of interest in truth and reconciliation over the past 2 years, and this interest has been driven in part by the multitude of inequities that COVID-19 has intensified for different groups of people, as well as the recent sudden awareness of the missing children and unmarked graves of former Indian residential school sites in Canada, with the latter being already well known to people who know the histories of these schools. In fact, one of the reports that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada published online in 2015 addresses the missing children and unmarked graves. So this information has been in the public domain for at least 6 years, meaning it's time that people awaken to the fuller or complex stories of what happened in those schools and their legacies. Today's presentation about physical education is set in the context of truth and reconciliation, which means we need to address the matter of genocide without turning away from this conversation. Now, this context might feel strange or even distressing to some listeners, and I think those feelings are understandable given the lack of attention to this historical relationship, the lack of attention that it's received in public discussions. But if we think about physical education not merely as a specific type of instruction in physical exercise without deep meaning or consequence, but really as a way to socialize youth into a particular culture, then its connection to genocide is not so strange, even though it might still be distressing. So my hope is that as people who work in this area begin to see the connections, discuss them, and work through the legacies in their classrooms, in their boardrooms, in their communities, then physical education will be able to live up to the liberatory vision that so many of us have for this type of education. So today's session is guided by 3 questions. One is, what does physical education have to do with truth and reconciliation? Second is, why is this relationship important to consider? And 3, what needs to be addressed to create meaningful change? And these are often the questions that I get when talking about the relationship between sport, physical education, and truth and reconciliation. And I have to say, I've been doing various presentations like this for about 15 years, well before the TRC came along. And these are always the questions that come up. So really in the span of 15 years, it's clear to me that people are beginning to think about and question and wrestle with these issues, but there's still fundamental questions that people are asking. So we'll cover these questions over 4 sections that I hope are insightful, challenging, and meaningful and helpful. So the first is changes and challenges since 2015. The second is physical education is a type of socialization. 3 is how did we get here? And then 4 is some takeaway points that I'm going to leave you with. But I'm also grateful to see that there is a follow-up session tomorrow being hosted by Ophea with Tim Fletcher, I believe, who will be doing a bit of a wrap-up, because it's always good to have someone pull these sessions together. We're going to have time at the very end of this session for some questions and answers, at which point I'll do my best to respond, recognizing that my expertise is not in the doing of physical education, but rather in thinking through the barriers and facilitators for change when it comes to physical culture and truth and reconciliation in Canada. So let's begin. And I want to begin here. With a brief overview of the work carried out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and selected changes and challenges that have arisen from this work with attention to physical education. As many of you probably know, in 2015, the TRC concluded its 7-year investigation into the history of the Indian residential school system in Canada and published its findings in a suite of reports, 18 in total, all available online. Totaling more than 4,000 pages, the reports explain how successive governments, in collaboration with religious denominations and private corporations, supported by other institutions like justice and media, attempted to eradicate Indigenous life in Canada, especially through the residential school system. It's important to point out that the state also operated day schools, which were on reserve, and the reports touch on the day schools. And these had the same vision and mission as the residential schools, which were usually far away from home to ensure family and community ties were broken. This meant that students, whether they went to day or residential school, were subjected to the same policy of assimilation. The overall intent was assimilation. So while the report provides an all-encompassing view of the problems inherent in state practices, schooling is the centerpiece to the story, demonstrating its centrality to Canada's assimilationist vision. The TRC was the most thorough examination of the residential school system ever undertaken, forming the capstone to more than 25 years of formal investigations into the history of schooling, the residential school system in Canada, beginning with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which published its findings and its roadmap for action in 1996. Although as a historian, I would also make the argument that there have been different points throughout the history of residential schools where people have publicly called out the schools as being a terrible policy, a horrible policy position that Canada took. But we can think of the last 25 years as a sustained investigation and a sustained era of investigation. So it's important to appreciate the significance of the TRC for Canada and for Canadians. I really like the way scholars Naomi Angel and Pauline Wakeham explain how extraordinary the TRC really is as a political process. And you can see this quote here in front of you, and I'll read it, or we can read it together. Canada became the first G8 nation and long-standing liberal democracy to initiate such a forum, an act that, in summoning the idioms and mechanisms of transnational justice typically employed in the aftermath of oppressive regimes, articulated a self-proclaimed liberal democratic nation to the scene of apartheid in South Africa, civil war in El Salvador, and military dictatorship in Chile. So it's quite a statement. So basically what it says is that by agreeing to engage in a TRC, Canada had conceded its attempt at genocide, placing itself alongside nations that the government had previously condemned for atrocities that had been committed elsewhere. So this was not only cultural genocide, such as the loss of Indigenous languages, traditions, and customs, including their own physical practices, which has led to profound problems on their own, but the willful extermination of people through such means as starvation, inadequate healthcare, and environmental destruction that resulted in loss of life. So with the TRC, Canada had admitted its guilt. And the challenge then for everyone at its conclusion in 2015 was to figure out how to move forward. So I think it's safe to say that most Canadians were bewildered about what to do next after the TRC was done. Many still are. And I think this is to be expected, given that there is no clear roadmap to get from point A to point B. I believe the absence, though, of a clear roadmap is actually a strength, since it forces people to think very carefully about the future. And this means that people need to be engaged in problem solving together rather than mechanically implementing a plan like you would for a kitchen recipe or when figuring out a technical manual. So what do we have to help us move forward? Well, we have the 94 calls to action, which are a list of actionable items found in one of the reports called the 94 calls to action. The calls to action provide direction for what needs to be done in key sectors such as education, child welfare, healthcare, justice, media, commemoration, sport, and so on. It's important to understand that the calls to action, to understand them not as discrete, standalone items, but as an integrated whole, where one call to action could be bundled with another, resulting in a more robust, meaningful response. So, for instance, one or more of the calls to action for education can be paired with health and sport, or language and culture, or sports and commemoration, or cultural and youth programs, and so on. So clustering the calls to action makes sense, considering the complex nature of physical education as a schooling practice. It was another tool for socialization. It was another tool for assimilation. And the same could be said of sports, which is mostly the area that I tend to work in. So the calls to action are supported by 10 principles found in another document produced by the TRC called What Have We Learned? Principles for Truth and Reconciliation. The titles are fairly self-explanatory. These 10 principles are about dialogue and action, honoring historic agreements and treaties in modern contexts, and prioritizing Indigenous experiences and ways of knowing, and seeing them as legitimate knowledge, not just to address problems specific to Indigenous people, but to address larger societal issues as well. And there's been advancements in some sectors because of the TRC. For instance, some branches in the environmental sector are waking up to the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge to reduce climate change, a problem that the entire world is facing. In the health sector, workers are beginning to learn about Indigenous medicinal practices and views about health to transform the way they care for Indigenous patients, knowing this knowledge could benefit other patients too. Many schools, especially at the post-secondary level, where I work, are implementing Indigenous strategic plans, plans that they developed to guide their indigenization efforts and are being resourced to do this work, such as curriculum development, securing new hires, building new facilities, enhancing policies and practice, all of which are important for systemic change. And of course, many changes remain, such as the one that we have in front of us today, especially in areas where there have been few structured opportunities to explore how their field is entangled with truth and reconciliation. And this shortage is troubling because it hinders our ability to imagine a new way forward and then work towards that future. So consider for a minute, just consider for a minute, how many opportunities have you had since 2015 to discuss how physical education is tied to truth and reconciliation? Why is it so important in the context of truth and reconciliation? If you had had opportunities, what has been the substance of those discussions? What kind of human and financial resources do you have to do this work? Do you have a policy specific to your discipline to guide your actions? And do you understand when your work is helping or hindering truth and reconciliation? I know from my own research experience that physical education and sports have not yet received as much attention as they should have when it comes to the TRC. Because just as students were forced to adopt English or organized religion or other ways to labor, farming, for instance, or other forms of manual labor, they were also required to adopt new physical behaviors that were meant to supplant their own. There is more than enough historical evidence to show that Indian agents, missionaries, policymakers, school instructors, really the entire schooling network, knew that getting Indigenous people to practice new physical behaviors would facilitate assimilation. That's what they believed. They believed that by breaking down their connection to Indigenous land-based lifestyles, to their belief systems, and even to their entire culture, that physical education, as well as organized sports, that this was central to this part of the breaking down process, that was central to assimilation. So every culture in the world values moving bodies, but places different values on those bodies. What one culture might think is beautiful and appealing and thus should be revered and supported, another might think is deviant and immoral and should be controlled and discouraged. What people value stems from their culture, meaning their attitudes and beliefs towards socially constructed ideas about how people should be moving their bodies. And these are attached to ideas about gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, able-bodiedness, health, beauty, and so on. The Olympic and Paralympic Games are good examples of our current worldwide fascination with moving bodies. Every 2 years, people all over the world get in heated debates about what is extraordinary, about what is inspiring, about what is repulsive, or perhaps even bizarre. Each games, with their own different types of sports, with different types of bodies, generates different emotions, different assessments, and even different levels of interest. So consider briefly the images that you have in front of you right now on the screen. Just think about them for a minute. What is the first word, or perhaps your first thoughts that come to mind? For instance, what image do you find most beautiful? Or perhaps most startling? Or perhaps one that you're unsure of? And why do you feel that way? Conversely, what image does not grab your attention, or perhaps even turns you off? And why? Our responses speak volumes about our cultural attitudes towards physical culture. And this means what we make our bodies do and don't do, or what we make other people do to their bodies, where and when and under what conditions, is an expression of our cultural values. This means movement is never apolitical. There is always consequence and meaning that stems from doing one thing one way and not another. So if all physical movement is loaded with meaning and is culturally significant, what happens when one group imposes its views about physical movement onto another group? Can't the subordinate group just adopt the new practices and move on? I mean, this is the basis for why physical education needs to be reimagined within the context of truth and reconciliation. It's that simple question that forces us to should force us to reconsider this broader context. So let's have a look at that context. In Shingwak's Vision, A History of Native Residential Schools, published in 1996, historian J.R. Miller discusses the difference between education and schooling. Oftentimes, those two terms are used interchangeably as if they were the same thing, but they're not. They are two vastly different ways of socializing children into a broader culture. Whereas education is a process that all cultures of the world engage in, not all cultures use schooling to educate their young. And this is a critical distinction that is useful for thinking through the relationship between physical education and truth and reconciliation, because it forces us to consider what physical education is as a formal discipline and what role it played in the making of Canada. Here's a very simple exercise to get us thinking about the difference between education and schooling. Just imagine we're all 100 years or so into the past, and you and your family depended on the land for survival. Now think, what physical skills and competencies would you need to get by? What would you need in order to get your food? What would you need in order to build your shelter, to make your clothing, to fend off attack? Because all of those are your necessities of life. So what physical skills and competencies would you need to get by? Just take a few minutes to create a list. Aim for 3 if you can. What do you need to get your food, to build your shelter, to make your clothing, to fend off attack? Well, prior to European settlement in Canada, Indigenous people lived on the land, and to do so, they needed to be fit. And so they trained for survival. For instance, they needed endurance for running short and long distances, to chase game, or for protection. They needed strength for carrying or hauling items such as food, shelter, or even for warfare. They needed power, which is strength plus speed for taking down game. Accuracy for hunting and warfare. Balance for traveling over uneven terrain. Pain tolerance to keep on with survival. Now, did any of you have 3 of those on your list? Because those would be your skills and competencies for living on the land 100 years ago. Well, the games and contests that Indigenous people are engaged in were more than fun pastimes. They built the competencies they needed for their land-based lifestyles. Their games and contests were therefore essential for survival. They were required training for life on the land. Equally important, their games and contests reinforced their connection to the land because the land was their home. Home meant traveling on the land, and it wasn't limited to one definitive spot as we do now, where we have a specific address. And it's also important not to confuse this traveling with being a nomad. Indigenous people didn't just travel the land or wander aimlessly on the land without direction. They had clear ties to different parts of the land, which meant they had a rich and detailed understanding of the land that they traveled on. They knew exactly where they were going based on knowledge handed down through the generations. And that's why when the Europeans came, they depended on them for survival, because Indigenous people knew how to get from one place to the next without calamity. They knew which parts of the land and water to traverse and when, and which parts to avoid. They knew where to get game or fish, where to get the edible berries and shrubs, where to get the good materials for shelter. They knew how to read the land that they were on. So the home was the land that they traveled on. Beginning in the 1800s, European settlers began to impose their own definitions of appropriate physical behavior onto Indigenous people, using policies and legislation to enforce their own views. And these changes had profound effects on Indigenous lives. Just consider something simple, a favorite pastime of Canadians, like fishing. Let's just think about fishing for a minute. In the mid-1800s, Canadian anglers lobbied to have their own ideas about sport fishing enshrined into law. And they did this to curtail Indigenous rights to fish and hunt for subsistence, claiming that Indigenous ways of fishing using spears and gill nets were uncivilized and harmed the environment. What the anglers failed to realize, or at least failed to acknowledge, was that Indigenous fishing methods were highly efficient. Spearing was more effective than angling as a means of selecting fish by size and weight and class. But it was the Canadian sportsman's views and the angler's definition of appropriate sporting behavior that became enshrined in law, and it remains an obstacle to Indigenous fishing practices today. So what we see then through the 1800s and early 1900s is how Indigenous connections to their land and water was undercut by the nation state. Indigenous people, weakened by disease and starvation and warfare, were displaced onto reserves and settlements so that the games and contests that once sustained their land-based lifestyles no longer served the same purpose or carried the same meaning. Oops. The move to gain control over Indigenous economic subsistence activities through redefinitions of physical behavior was soon followed by prohibitions against traditional religious ceremonies. Church and state officials expressed frustration at what they saw as a lack of spiritual and economic progress among Indigenous people. And they attributed the problem not to their own cultural biases or to the impoverished environments that Indigenous people had been forced into, but to Indigenous people's ongoing participation in their so-called backward customs. They characterized Indigenous ceremonies such as the potlatch and the sun dance, two critical ceremonies, especially for people on the plains. They characterized them, and they could also be extremely physically demanding, these ceremonies, but they were characterized as deviant and immoral, especially in cases where body piercing was part of the protocol, saying they left the people poor and were counterproductive to Christian conversion. Many Indigenous people were communally oriented, and they had to be in order to survive. And many of their ceremonies, therefore, revolved around the redistribution of goods and involved the destruction of property as a form of cultural expression. And this destruction of property and this redistribution practice helped to confirm and maintain social and family relations, and it was an important part of who they were. But these practices also challenged European notions of ownership and thrift that lay at the heart of the growing capitalist economy in Canada. And these practices also challenged European sense of propriety, especially where the body was concerned. I mean, never mind that in the 1800s, men of the genteel class could still legally engage in a duel to the death if their reputation was questioned. Or that by the 1900s, many Canadians believed the bloody sport of boxing, if it was conducted properly with scientific rules, was a vital training ground for teaching boys how to be men. And of course, these brutal practices, social practices that were brought over by the Europeans were sometimes challenged, but they were legal, even if someone died as a result of the contest. And we still have boxing today. So Euro-Canadian physical culture was used to impose such free definitions onto Indigenous people. Missionaries, Indian agents, and federal policymakers supported and encouraged Indigenous people to take part in these new physical practices by making it legal for them to engage in their own old-time practices and by supporting their involvement in the new ones, wanting to instill an appreciation for what they called reasonable amusements, ones that aligned with dominant understandings of appropriate work and leisure, femininity, masculinity, nationhood, and so on. So the formal establishment of the Indian residential school system in the late 1800s further undercut forms of Indigenous education on the land and reinforced settler ideas about what proper education should look like. Missionaries had tried to establish schools, especially in Eastern Canada, as early as the 1600s, but those failed to take root. There was little incentive for Indigenous people to alter their ways of life. Their knowledge of the environment and its resources were still central to who they were and to their survival, and it provided everything that they needed. So missionaries had to wait more than 200 years before their visions for schooling could be implemented. And this was achieved only after Indigenous people had been weakened by disease and starvation, and after they had acquiesced to living on reserves. And on those small parcels of land that they were confined to further ruptured their land-based lifestyles, forcing them to adjust rapidly to new foreign ways of life and living. In 1860, responsibility for Indian affairs transferred from the British Crown to the province of Canada, and the Department of Indian Affairs was established. In 1867, of course, we have Confederation, and the new federal government was given legislative responsibility for Indian affairs. And soon after that, an administrative team was given responsibility for creating a national policy on Indian education. They formed relationships with organized religious institutions, including the Roman Catholic, Protestant, Anglican, and Presbyterian denominations, among others, to implement its program for schooling. And so it was in this fashion that church and state came to dominate Indigenous lives in Canada, pooling their limited human and financial resources to re-educate Indigenous children. And so for more than 100 years, from 1880, when the first policy on Indian education was drafted, to 1996, when the last federally funded school closed its doors, more than 150,000 children received this new type of education away from home and off the land, with many never returning home. So in both the residential and day schools, people involved with the school system enacted their own ideas about what was appropriate physical culture for Indigenous boys and girls, about what was healthy, about what proper bodily comportment looked like, about the appropriate separation of work and leisure, about instilling deference to authority, about sporting nationalism, or what sport signified Canada, and a whole range of other deep meanings that were integral to the program of assimilation. So there are many instances in the historical records where school officials state that physical education and organized sports were more effective than the classroom in bringing about fundamental changes in the values and behaviors of the students. So there's two broad phases differentiated by amendments to the Indian Act in 1951 that characterize the federal approach towards Indian education in Canada. And the policy approach taken during each phase shaped the types of opportunities that were encouraged in the schools, as well as on reserves. Typically, before 1951, what we see from the late 1800s to the 1940s are waves of communicable diseases that were circulating through the schools and wreaking havoc on the young pupils. These children were overworked, they were underfed and fed substandard food, and they were also emotionally exhausted. And this led them to be vulnerable to virus and infection. And these matters were made worse by the terrible living conditions in the schools, which were characterized by overcrowded rooms and poor air circulation. Deaths were expected. This is why most technical drawings for the schools included a graveyard. And the Indian Affairs reports repeatedly mentioned how bad some of these schools are. So it was well known throughout the system how poor these schools were. Calisthenics, though, were widely used as part of the health curricula when the schools opened. For instance, in the 1899 report, the principal of the Capel Indian Residential School, which was then in the Northwest Territories, now in Saskatchewan, reported, and I'm reading the quote, "The physician in charge inspects frequently, and conditions conducive to health are maintained by an abundant use of vegetables and wholesome food, well prepared," which they probably brought out for the purpose of the inspection, "by cleanliness of person and premises, by clothing adapted to the seasons, and by plenty of outdoor exercise, drill, and calisthenics. The physique of pupils who have been here some time has been much improved." In 1910, Indian Affairs mandated these exercises be done at all schools in an effort to reduce the spread of pulmonary disease among the students. And they even created a booklet, which you can see here in front of you on the left-hand side of your screens. And this booklet was an instruction manual for teachers, explaining to them why these activities were important and what types of activities they needed to do in order to get their pupils healthy again. So these exercises were well suited for the schools. They required relatively little space and no equipment. They could be performed indoors when the weather was poor, though instructors were encouraged to move outdoors wherever possible to capitalize on space and the fresh air. And the instructors, most of whom would have been familiar with these activities, would have appreciated the manual, which offered more options for games and exercise than they might have been trained in. So Indigenous bodies, once a symbol of strength and virility, were repositioned within this new physical discourse of Indian affairs and in Canada as being weak and diseased, justifying the need for proper, orderly instruction on how to regain their vitality. And we see a number of comments throughout the Indian Affairs reports to this effect. So, for instance, the 1911 report by J.D. McLean, who at that time was the Assistant Deputy and Secretary for Indian Affairs, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, "It is now recognized that tuberculosis, that dread disease to which so many fall victim, is curable in its early stages and is spread preventable. Fresh air, nourishing food, and clean sanitary homes are the essential preventatives. The exercises which have been presented in the book, Calisthenics and Games, will also assist by improving and strengthening the physical condition of the boys and girls. It is desirable, therefore, that the greatest attention should be paid to the teaching of hygiene and calisthenics, and it is no doubted that you will give your best efforts to carrying out the wishes of the department." He's speaking to the teachers. Further, in that same report, the 1911 report, you can see the Section 9 of the contract that teachers signed with Indian Affairs. So you have all your contracts nowadays, and here's what your contract would have said in 1911, the Section 9 of your contract. And I'll read it. "It's to provide at the said school teachers and officers qualified to give the pupils religious instruction at proper times, to instruct the male pupils of the said school in gardening, farming, and care of stock, or such other industries as are suitable to their local requirements, to instruct the female pupils in cooking, laundry work, needlework, general housewifery, and dairy work, where such dairy work can be carried on, to teach all the pupils in the ordinary branches of an English education, to teach calisthenics, physical drill, and fire drill, to teach the effects of alcoholic drinks and narcotics on the human system, and how to live in a healthy manner, to instruct the older advanced pupils in the duties and privileges of British citizenship, explaining to them the fundamental principles of the Government of Canada, and training them in such knowledge and appreciation of Canada as will inspire them with respect and affection for the country and its laws." That would have been your role in 1911. And you can see physical education here in the form of calisthenics was an important part of that. So after 1951, amendments to the Indian Act meant that schools were supposed to follow provincial curricula. And this didn't happen for a number of reasons, such as still hiring untrained teachers, the schools operating as workhouses or poorhouses, a lack of teaching resources, and really a general orientation among school leaders who believed students were destined for manual labor or worse, that they were not intelligent enough to learn these subjects, and so on. One important change, though, with 1951 was the creation of a new position for physical education and recreation, and a supervisor of that new portfolio was hired that same year in 1951. And the purpose of the program was to develop PE programs, physical education programs, especially in the residential schools, but also in the day schools and on reserves. So I should say that organized sports had always been played at many of the schools throughout the country. For instance, in the 1909 report from the principal of the Elkhorn Industrial School in Manitoba, he confirmed that recreation was an important part of their program. And I'll read you a quote from this person's report, his report. He says, "Systematic recreation for these children is a very important feature here, and I always like to foster a healthy spirit of sport to fair play among them. Football always has been and will be the principal game for the boys, there being a very good football around. Last year's team all but won the championship in the Central League. Baseball and hockey have their turn in season, and for the latter, we have our own rink, which the boys leveled and flooded themselves. The same principal provided more descriptive commentary in his 1910 report. So in the following year, he goes on to say, in an institution for Indian children, recreation is an especially important feature and is here always encouraged as much as possible, consistent with the proper carrying out of the industrial training. Our football team is one of the best in this part of the country, and at hockey and baseball, we do almost equally well, while our band keeps up its reputation, its services being in great demand during the summer, though we cannot accept more than a few of the engagements. For the girls, there are handball, tennis, and other games, and also skating, for which latter we have our own rink. They also frequently go for walks in summer, accompanied by one or more of the ladies on staff. So that's prior to 1951. In the early 1900s, with the 1951 revisions to the Indian Act and the creation of this new portfolio, we see more emphasis on organized sports and the more formalization of organized sports within Indian affairs, at least symbolically, because they weren't all that well supported. Schools were pretty much left to their own devices still in terms of trying to implement physical education, trying to find their own resources, their own games, their own manuals, and carve time out of the schedule to make way for this. So this firmed up institutionalized settler beliefs about the value of organized sports as part of the physical education program. Organized sports were believed to foster integration with white youth, teach fundamental social skills to Indigenous students who would need these skills to succeed in the white world. Things like competitive individualism, appropriate male and female behaviors, deference to authority, all of which privileged white settler norms. They also believed that these sports rounded out the schooling experience, making the students happy and more content and more likely to appreciate schooling. And of course, there were other reasons. School officials often comment on how sports discouraged runaways, how it made the school look good in the eyes of the public with smiling, happy faces, and the students acting in ways that the settlers understood and appreciated. And it also deflected attention away from the negative, controversial aspects of schooling. And we see statements like that to that effect in the Indian Affairs reports. So, ideas about appropriate physical culture have always been wrapped up in efforts to conquer new lands, whether in Canada or elsewhere. The literature in my field of study, in sports studies, is really robust in terms of looking at this part of imperial history. European missionaries, government agents, and other imperial authorities, particularly those from the British Empire, have a long track record of attempting to bring Indigenous people under control by constraining and regulating their physical movements. And these newcomers were intrigued by Indigenous people's strength, speed, agility, and endurance, as much as they were appalled and even threatened by what Indigenous physicality signified: independence, sovereignty, and difference, all of which had to be eliminated and replaced with new embodied practices for the new dominion of Canada to take shape. And these conversion strategies, as you saw, included such things as controlling access to hunting and fishing rights, the creation of reserves, eliminating Indigenous ceremonial practices and schooling, all of which included new ways of moving the body, which devastated but did not destroy Indigenous people or their culture, but it did cause profound harm. In At the Bridge, James Tate and the Anthropology of Belonging, historian Wendy Wickwire tells the story of James Tate, an anthropologist who worked with and lived alongside the Indigenous people in southern BC from 1884 until his death in 1922. Tate was an unusual anthropologist for his day because he was fluent in the languages of the people he wrote about, and therefore he understood who they were and what kind of a relationship they wanted to have with government, and even for a time, Tate served as translator and advocate for them in Ottawa. In one of his writings, he wrote many things, but in one of his writings, Tate explains the damaging effects of rabid population loss on the Inkplakamuk caused by the large influx of miners on their lands in the late 1800s. In one passage, he notes how the Inkplakamuk observed their loss by connecting their health to their physical practices. And you can see the quote here in front of you from James Tate. It says, "The Indians say that formerly they were very healthy and were seldom subject to disease. Very few died in childhood and many lived to an extreme old age. It is said that their ancestors were taller than the people of the present day. They were also stouter, stronger, hardier, and more active and agile than is the case now. Many men were exceedingly fleet of foot, and others excelled in leaping and in wrestling, owing to the careful training and to frequent practice when playing games." And this is an anthropologist who was commenting on the health of the people he was working with because he had to provide a report on their health. So, what are the takeaway points? This is not an instructional manual for how to address some of the challenges that you might be experiencing either in the classroom or developing policy for your school or perhaps for your school board. But what it is advocacy and a really good explanation for why understanding the context between physical education and truth and reconciliation is central to whichever way you're going to move forward. Oftentimes I find people don't understand the relationship between the two, but this is the part of truth and reconciliation that needs to be understood before one can move on. So I hope this presentation helped with that. I think the understanding is really important. So is the broader context, as I've shown you. But there are also other models out there that you can look to for support. So, for instance, while there might not be a dedicated conversation yet to physical education and truth and reconciliation in your school or perhaps your school board or your community, there are probably models around you to look to, for instance, around truth and reconciliation within your school or truth and reconciliation within a specific discipline like history or health or science, and how to understand these aspects of life from Indigenous points of view. There are conversations happening, I think, within Indigenous specific contexts around the role of physical education, sport, and physical activity and truth and reconciliation, just as there are conversations that are beginning to happen in kind of mainstream diverse settings. And so those models are something that you could look forward to help guide your process as well. And finally, in my experience and from what I understand, the local context is always the most meaningful. Where you work and where you live is situated on specific lands of specific people. And it is those specific histories and practices and knowledges that need to be incorporated into your schooling practice in order to help physical education, again, reach those liberatory aspirations that we all have for using physical culture to be healthy and happy. And so it's those three takeaway points, I think, that I have to leave you with. One is understanding the broader context is really important. 2, you can look for models around you. And 3, understanding the local context that you work in is absolutely essential for addressing truth and reconciliation in your classroom or in your playing fields in order to move forward. So hi. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. And that's it for today. I guess we can have the Q&A now.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Not really a question, just more of an observation. I really liked how, Janice, at the beginning of this session, you provided that picture with the different types of movement that just allowed us to think about how movement connects to us. And I really liked how you phrased those questions so that it allowed us as educators and adults to see where we sit when we see those pictures and how we connect ourselves and our in our profession with movement and health and physical education in general, right? And I think that really taps into the other sessions too, in terms of we all have biases and sometimes we forget that, and no, I just wanted to thank you for sharing that perspective of what movement can mean to different people, right? And not just us, but obviously our students too, right? When we think about the games, the activities, the equipment, right? And where we play, the location. So lots of great connections when I saw that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. It's actually when I used to teach a course in Canadian sport history and as well as Olympic history, I would often have slides where I would show different images depending on what we were talking about. And like you said, it's a really good way to get students to think about, their own cultural predispositions to movement, to bodies. And that opened up a whole range of discussions about, what we think is beautiful, what we think is healthy, what we think is abhorrent. And then it allows us to talk about, why we think that and to unpack the assumptions, that are wrapped up in those kind of conversations. Because imagine yourself, as a representative of Canada in the late 1800s, early 1900s, witnessing an Indigenous cultural practice for the first time, and you bring your own cultural baggage with you. Mm-hmm. And maybe you don't understand what you're seeing, and maybe you do understand what you're seeing, but you still carry that cultural baggage with you. But then you also have the authority to impose, new ways of moving the body on Indigenous people, and you do that, through policy and legislation, or you support the policy and legislation that is out there. And so, the same things are happening all the time, like every day. It's just we're doing it in a modern context, right?
Go ahead, Tanya.
Yeah, I had more of a comment as well, not so much a question. I loved the question that you asked in the beginning around what if you depended on the land for survival, what competencies would you need? The PHE Canada conference earlier this year, when they did their 3-part series and they had an Indigenous perspective, 3 different sessions that they offered. And one of them was all about connecting to the land and connecting health and phys ed to the land. And I love that connection piece because it made it more meaningful. So I really see the overlap between like that meaningful PE that Tim's going to be talking about tomorrow, that connection to the land, and then the competencies and how you could kind of mix that all together and almost plan your program around it. With regards to phys ed, I just love that piece of it because it just makes it, I think it really makes students think about why we're doing certain activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also, and again, a lot of these discussion points here, I also engage with my students, right? And that is another one, because I get my students to imagine, life 100 years ago and life now. Like, do we still need pain tolerance? As a competency to get by every day. And most of my students say no. And so then we see that, okay, well, we can't just superimpose the past on the present. But the point is to, understand what it is that Indigenous people, especially when they come from a specific culture, what they're looking for, in terms of engaging in physical activity. Sometimes it may be, connected back to land, but other times it's not. So it's not something that we can just assume, is relevant to all cultures. So for instance, ideas about, or the importance of sovereignty to a community might be really important. So engaging in a specific physical practice in order to instill in the kids an appreciation for, a reminder of, a deep connection to who they are as people. And I'm thinking of more traditional forms of lacrosse as a really good example, or up in the far north, with the Athabascan and the Dene, and they do their own traditional games. some of you, you might know through the Arctic Winter Games, those games that are now played in a competitive sport format, aren't necessarily tied to survival on the land anymore, but they are ways to instill in the youth an appreciation for where they come from and who they are, right? And so it's this kind of a deep cultural connection, I think, in a modern day context that requires a lot more conversation and work, as opposed to an apolitical kind of, and we're going to do this activity because it's just, it's really good for you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know what kind of rationalizations people are using in the classroom, but there's always some sort of deep connection to who we are, right? And we just need to be more conscious of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other thing that was talked about quite a bit was that seasonal connection. So, why we do certain activities during certain seasons, and so that piece was also kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a really interesting comment in the chat, Janice, from someone noting that. So in one of the earlier slides, you mentioned this concept of integration of Indigenous students into society, and the participant is noting that the term integration is still used to this day in ELL, which I think is English language learner materials. So it's making this person wonder about our views of students who are in that stream or taking those courses. And I think it's just really interesting because it's this idea of, colonialist practices are like, they're all around us in a number of spaces. And so I think that's a really interesting observation and reflection around models and frameworks that we're imposing and folks that we're trying to integrate into colonial ways of being.
Yeah, and it's, and that's a really good example, I think, of how, language, is so commonplace, which makes these, old-time colonial practices very subtle, right?
Yes.
And easily missed. And, what happens when we use that kind of language where we want to integrate, students, Indigenous students or whoever, into a particular culture, that particular culture becomes the apolitical norm, as if there is no meaning or consequence of doing that. And, and the absence of a relationship flowing the other way, of teaching people about the Indigenous land that they're on, of what kind of physical practices would have been engaged there, what happened to them, what kind of practices do they do today, what is meaningful, to Indigenous people today. It's very, those conversations I think are much more infrequent. And so the relationship tends to flow one way when that kind of language is used, and it encourages that kind of a relationship, right? As opposed to, okay, we live in Indigenous territory. Let's talk about the land that we're on, and what it means to live on this land, and what it means to be healthy, what it means to, engage in physical activity for, community building, and for the people here, kind of thing. And that's a very different conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for causing all of us to reflect, right? And I think as practitioners in all of our own spaces, I think you raised some really powerful questions that will impact my practice personally, and I'm sure others. Just in approaching the conversations that we're having, our pedagogies, and how we're planning with our colleagues. So thank you so much, Janice, for taking the time with us. I hope that we'll be able to have subsequent conversations with you. There's a lot of thank yous coming in through the chat to you. So thank you so much. We're really grateful and humbled to have had the opportunity to spend this time with you.
And thank you. And thank you again to everyone just for taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. And I know, the more we have these conversations, like I said, I've been teaching aspects of this for 15 years. I think the more adept we can become at having this conversation and imagine new ways forward. And that's just how change happens, right? The more we engage, the better we'll all be.
Exactly. I was thinking the same thing. This certainly isn't, this is perhaps a first conversation, but certainly not the last. And so hopefully we will continue to have it with you and each other. So thank you so much.